The night air over Guadalcanal on August 21, 1942, was thick enough to feel like a weight pressing against the chest. At exactly 3:07 a.m., Private First Class Frank Pomeroy crouched low behind a 37mm gun dug into coral sand at the mouth of a place the maps called Alligator Creek. To Pomeroy, 24 years old and far from home, it was just another dark strip of ground that smelled of salt, rot, and fear. Sweat soaked his uniform despite the hour. His hands worked by memory, guided by feel rather than sight, as he lifted a shell his Marine instructors had never trained him to fire at men. This round was stubby, heavy, and strange. Inside it were not armor-piercing explosives meant for steel, but 122 steel balls packed together like death waiting to be unloosed. Pomeroy had trained as a machine gunner. The 37mm gun was supposed to stop tanks. Tonight, it had been turned into something else entirely. Across a sandbar no wider than 45 yards, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was assembling 917 elite Japanese infantrymen for a bayonet charge that he believed would decide the fate of Guadalcanal before dawn. These were not second-rate troops or exhausted garrison soldiers. They were veterans of China, men drilled to believe that spirit and willingness to die could shatter any enemy line. Ichiki believed the Americans were undisciplined, soft, dependent on machines, and incapable of standing firm against a determined night assault. His men whispered prayers to the Emperor, fixed bayonets, and prepared to charge screaming into the dark surf. What none of them understood was that, on the far side of that sandbar, American Marines had abandoned doctrine and replaced it with mathematics. Pomeroy's gun commander had described the 37mm gun's new role in brutally simple terms. It wasn't a cannon anymore. It was a giant shotgun aimed at a doorway, and that doorway was the sandbar where hundreds of men would soon be forced to cross. When fired, each canister round would burst open just after leaving the barrel, spraying steel balls outward in a widening cone at nearly 2,500 feet per second. At that range, the projectiles would arrive in less than 6/100ths of a second. No human reflex could react. No courage could outrun physics. But as Pomeroy listened to distant clanking gear and shouted Japanese commands echo across the water, he had no way of knowing that his obsolete gun was about to carve a lesson into the Imperial Japanese Army that would echo across the Pacific for the rest of the war. All along the Marine perimeter around Henderson Field, men waited in silence. More than 11,000 Marines were stretched thin around a rough, broken ring of foxholes and machine gun pits hacked out of coral with captured shovels. Major General Alexander Vandegrift studied his maps by lamplight, fully aware that the first American offensive of the Pacific War balanced on a fragile defensive line. 2 weeks earlier, the landing had felt almost too easy. The airfield had fallen quickly. But the victory at Savo Island had sent the Navy fleeing, leaving the Marines short of food, heavy equipment, and ammunition. If this perimeter failed, there would be no rescue. Australia was 1,000 miles away. Colonel Clifton Cates, a veteran of Below Wood, had been given the eastern sector. He understood terrain the way experienced infantrymen do, not as lines on a map, but as places where men must move, slow, stop, or die. Alligator Creek wasn't really a creek at all. It was a shallow lagoon that forced attackers into predictable paths. Cates anchored his defense there and made a single, unconventional decision that would shape the night. Instead of spreading his two 37mm anti-tank guns along the line, he concentrated both to cover the sandbar where the creek met the sea. There were no Japanese tanks coming. But there were Japanese soldiers, and they would have to cross that sand. Pomeroy spent the afternoon of August 20th deepening his gun pit, stacking sandbags, and rehearsing movements he would soon perform without thinking. The gun weighed nearly 1,000 pounds and required a 5-man crew, but the loader's job was the most unforgiving. If he slowed, men died. The canister rounds beside him were thin-walled and marked differently than anything he had used before. Each held steel balls the size of marbles, packed tight, waiting to spread outward like a steel storm. At 50 yards, those balls would still strike close together. A man sprinting full speed would take over 10 seconds to cross that distance. The steel would arrive almost instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock moved quietly along the line, checking machine guns, mortars, and artillery observers. Everything was pre-registered. The mortars had ranges memorized. The machine guns overlapped fields of fire. The artillery was ready to answer calls within minutes. But it was the 37mm guns that represented the greatest gamble. No manual said this should work. No doctrine approved of it. But warfare rarely waits for approval. As darkness settled, reports filtered in from scouts and listening posts. A large Japanese force had landed to the east and was advancing along the coast. One Marine patrol had already ambushed the enemy, killing dozens. The survivors reported well-equipped troops, confident and aggressive. A wounded Solomon Islander scout staggered into the perimeter just before sunset, his body torn by bayonets. He had endured torture without speaking, but his warning was clear. The attack would come before dawn. Across the creek, Ichiki reviewed his plan. The march from the landing point had been long, but his men were strong. He dismissed concerns about the ambushed patrol. Losses were acceptable. Speed and shock would carry the day. Some of his officers hesitated. One captain, who had seen Japanese infantry shredded by Soviet artillery years earlier, warned that open ground favored the defender. Ichiki rejected the concern. He believed completely in the doctrine that had brought Japan victory after victory. A straight line, maximum force, and spiritual superiority. Henderson Field lay beyond the sandbar. He would take it tonight. At 12:45 a.m., the sound of Japanese preparations drifted across the water. Metal clanked. Voices rose. Marines withdrew their listening posts and waited. Pomeroy lifted his first canister round and settled into position. At 1:30, Japanese machine guns opened fire. Mortar shells fell among the Marine lines, probing for weak points. The Marines waited. At 1:38 a.m., the order came. Machine guns opened up in steady, disciplined bursts. And then the 37mm guns fired. The first canister round burst in midair and turned the sandbar into a wall of flying steel. Japanese soldiers fell not one by one, but in clusters. Pomeroy loaded again. 8 seconds later, another blast. The steel arrived before the sound. Men running forward suddenly ceased to exist as organized units. Courage dissolved into chaos. The air itself seemed lethal. The first wave disintegrated. A few survivors reached the Marine line and fought savagely, but they were isolated and overwhelmed. Ichiki ordered another assault. More men charged. More steel met them. The second wave fared worse than the first. Bodies piled where squads had once advanced. The sandbar became impassable. By 3 a.m., half of Ichiki's force was gone. The Marines still held. Ammunition was steady. Casualties were light. Dawn came slowly, revealing devastation across the sand. The survivors pulled back into the coconut grove east of the creek. Artillery began to fall. Marine infantry crossed upstream and closed the trap. Aircraft from Henderson Field screamed overhead, strafing the beach. Tanks rolled forward, firing canister into foxholes at point-blank range. By afternoon, organized resistance collapsed. Ichiki's regiment ceased to exist. Out of 917 men, nearly 800 were dead. Fewer than 50 escaped. Marine losses numbered in the dozens. Pomeroy stood beside his gun as burial details worked in silence. The weapon meant for tanks had rewritten the rules of infantry combat. The myth of spiritual supremacy had shattered against steel and mathematics. Henderson Field remained American. And on a forgotten sandbar, the Pacific War changed forever.